Today we're going to be talking about values in JavaScript. And values, these are just values that are in JavaScript language, but there are different values that are in Python, Ruby, etc. So whichever one that you're going to be doing, you would look at the values for those, but we're going to be talking about the values in JavaScript. Now, what are values in JavaScript? Well, there's primitive values in JavaScript, and then there are objects. So primitive values are values that cannot be changed. So what do you mean by that? Well, we'll go over it in a little bit, but you can think of a value that you cannot change. So it sounds slightly confusing because we just went over variables and we said, oh, well, hey, we can change that variable. So for instance, we did const person equals John, right? And we said, okay, well, we might be able to change this. We can't change a const, but we could probably change a let, right? We could change that. So what does a primitive mean that you can't change it? Well, we're not talking about the variable. We're talking about the actual value itself. So this string here cannot be changed. Whatever you put this string as, it cannot be changed. Now, you can change the value of what's inside this box, but the actual value itself cannot be changed. So we can liken this to just like we're moving and we're putting things inside of a box. We put plates inside the box. Now you can exchange those plates for cups inside that box, but the plate is always going to be a plate. The cup is always going to be a cup. You can't change and turn that plate into a cup, nor can you turn the cup into a plate. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about primitives, and the actual value themselves cannot be altered and cannot be changed. So we couldn't go into the string and we can't change this string here. We can change the value or the information inside this variable. We can reassign it to something else, but this string itself is immutable. It means it cannot be mutated or cannot be changed. And anytime that it seems like you're changing something, you're actually creating a new version of it. You're not actually changing the actual string itself, so these are immutable. So let's go over what these types are. And you may have heard these before, but we'll go over them and in a little bit of detail. We'll explain exactly what they are and how you would possibly use them. So Boolean type. Booleans are true or false values. So for instance, that would either be a true or a false. That is Boolean. Boolean can be one or two things. It can be true or it can be false. And once again, we can assign this to a variable. So we can say let is hungry is equal to true, right? A person probably is hungry. They can be hungry. But we can change that, right? This is a changeable variable. So we can say is hungry is now equal to the false. And now the output of is hungry is false, right? So a Boolean is a true or false value, and it can only be true or false. So Boolean types can be yes or no, true or false. They're either true or they're false. How it works. Now, what about a null type? A null type here is just what it says, null. This is literally just null. Now, what actually is null? We can actually console log this out and see what null actually is. What is null? Null is null. Exactly what it is. Null is null. That's what it is. But there is a slight quirk in JavaScript, which we'll get to later, on why when you compare things to null, sometimes it's an empty object. But we won't worry about that right now. But the null type is null. This is useful if you need to null out a value. So you may have something here that you say, okay, well, let person equal Sam, and I want to null this value out. So now I want to say person equals null, right? So now what is person? Person is now null. This can be useful for a variety of different things. But that is the null type. It is just null. As simple as it sounds. It is literally just null. And we'll say what that is. That is null. And the Boolean type here, we'll put this. This is either true or false. Now, undefined. The exact same thing as null. It is literally undefined. So when would you find this type, an undefined type? Well, it would be a variable that has not been assigned a value. So for instance, if we said, take the analogy, let person, right? What is person? Person is undefined. You see that there? Person is undefined because we haven't actually defined the variable. It is undefined. It doesn't have a definition. It has nothing inside the box. It is an empty box. So this is where you would find an undefined variable, or a variable that does not have a definition or does not have a value. So these are what undefined type is. Number type. So this one is pretty straightforward. So these are all numbers. So this could be the number 1 all the way to the number 1,000, 100,000, whatever number it is. It can also be negative number. So we could say a -1, -10, things like that. These can also be floats or decimal numbers. So 10.0, right? We can see what that is. See that number type there. So those are numbers. Pretty straightforward. Big int. So the big int type is interesting because a big int actually allows us to classify huge numbers. So what would be a huge number? Well, we could take this huge number. We want to add a whole bunch of zeros on this. This is a number that we can't quite classify, right? A huge, massive number. Big ints allow us to be able to do that. So we normally don't use this unless you're dealing with massive numbers, but it's good to know. So that's the big int type. String type we've been using quite a while, so strings are pretty easy. Strings are anything in between these quotation marks, so we could say person, or in between the double quotations, so we can say name. And these are strings. And we can put anything we want in between here. We can add strings together. Right? We can add strings together. So we could put this in a variable. So we can say let name equal person2, and we can say what name is person2, right? We name us together. If we want to put a space in there, we can put a space, right? Person2 there. We see what that is there. So strings are anything inside of a single quotation or a double quotation, and we can use that. We can also use backticks, but we usually don't do this unless we're doing template literals, and we'll get into that in a later course. But those are strings. Pretty straightforward. Symbols are a type that we don't quite use too often. You may come across this, but you usually don't come across this too much. Symbols are, you can create a symbol just by doing symbol here. And you could use this in a program to denote maybe a different kind of type, things like that you want. These are kind of used in higher programs where they want to create something that's brand new, maybe something that JavaScript doesn't offer them. This is something that they would probably use. So this would be a symbol type. You usually won't run into this too much, so there's not too much to worry about this. You would definitely know if you ran into a symbol type. So we'll say symbol here. Now, One thing that you may be wondering is, well, I have to keep up with all these different types. How do I know which type is which? And you may be thinking, well, a Boolean, I kind of know true or false. Um, but how do I know what is a number versus a string versus a symbol versus undefined versus all that different stuff? What's an easy way to tell? Well, JavaScript gives us a really handy way of seeing what types are. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually go through here and we're going to create variables for all of these, and then we're going to use a special, something special that JavaScript gives us. So we'll say let true, let bool equal true, and bool is just a short version of Boolean there. And we'll say let person equal null. And then we'll say let name equal, and we'll just keep to say let name there. And we'll say let plate equal 2. We'll say plates 2. And then our big int here, we'll say let huge number equal, and then we'll have a huge number here. Just a massive number here that we'll put in here. Massive number. And then we'll say let house equal house. And then we'll say let, we'll say new name equal symbol. There we go. And now what we can do is we can use a handy feature of JavaScript called type of. Type of. And this is what it is, type of. So we can say type of bool, right? What is the type of bool? We want to know what the type of bool is. So we can console.log, what is type of bool? Bool is a Boolean value. And it is, right? We see that it's Boolean value. Awesome, great. Now, what about our person? Person is an object. Interesting, right? So we see that type of person is an object, even though we see null logged out there. Well, back in the early days of JavaScript, there's actually a bug in JavaScript where null doesn't actually equal null. It actually equals an empty object, which is why null says object here. But it was so far into JavaScript, and there's so many things that are built on JavaScript that actually rely on null, they decided to keep it in. But this is something that you can know for your own edification, that null, when you do a type of null, it actually comes out to an object. So that's good to know. So what about name here? Let's do name. Name matches. Undefined. Nice. Awesome. So what about plates? Plates is a number. Awesome. That matches exactly what we have. And what about huge number? That gives us a number 2. Why does that give us a number? Well, in order to be able to make this a big int, we need to put something on the end of this. We usually would put an n on the end of this. See how this changes to a big int? So if we remove that from there, that's a number, and then we do that, that's now a big int. So that tells us that this is a massive number, and we want to qualify this as a big int. So that's a big int there. So what about house? House is a string. Exactly. Awesome. And new name? New name is a function. Now, why does this say that it's a function? Well, this, if you hover over this, this says a symbol constructor, which means that this technically is a function. So in order for us to be able to use it, we need to call it. And we'll get into functions and things like that. So we'll say put in name here. And now when we call this symbol, what happens? Now we see symbol here, right? So before, this was just a function, and now when we call it, it's now a symbol. So now it's a symbol. Now it's turned into a symbol for us. So all these types match up except, of course, null, right? Null is equal to type of object. And that goes back to the early days of JavaScript where there's actually a bug in JavaScript, which is very interesting. In all other languages, null does mean null, but that's one quirk in JavaScript. You'll notice that there are many quirks, but that is one quirk in JavaScript where null actually, the type of, gives you an object. So this has been a rundown of values, primitive values in JavaScript. The next course we're going to go over is we're going to go over what objects are. So hopefully this was helpful to go over values in JavaScript. Hopefully this gave you some more tools in your tool belt. And I will see you in the next video where we'll talk about objects.